Rediscovering the Mystical Heart of Our Faith. Presentations by Michael Whelan at a Reflection Morning, Maris Centre, August 21, 2004. Let me commence my input with two introductory words. One concerns the reason for focusing on this topic, recovering the mystical heart of our faith. The more I look at what's going on in our world and in the church and my own experience, the more I see this as the number one task for us. I personally experience it as the number one task for me. I don't think much else is going to make a lot of positive, life-giving difference if we haven't recovered the mystical heart of our faith. And worse than that, I think we are in grave danger of slipping away into some fairly destructive, death-dealing legalism and dogmatism if we don't recover the mystical heart of our faith. One of the experiences that prompts me in that direction is the experience of human structure and organization and institution. They are always reflective of the limits of human beings. Human institutions, human structures will always be fraught. They'll always be broken. They'll always be less than what might be. In every age, from the beginning of time until the end of time, that will be the case. There will never be the perfect institution. There will never be the perfect economic system or the perfect social reality. They will always be reflective of our own personal and corporate limitations. However, I think at the time in which we find ourselves, a time of rapid, profound, and immense change, the institutions as we know them are in deep trouble. I think they are less helpful than they were at another time. We can, in times of stability, establish institutions, and part of it's illusory, of course, but we wear our institutions like ill-fitting clothes. They bite us into the armpits and the buttons don't quite do up and they hang out at the belt and all the rest of it. And that applies to wider civil society as well as the church. One way to respond to that is the way that I see some of the decision makers in the church responding. I say this in a factual rather than a judgmental way. They respond by tightening up the authority, by increasing the rules, by trying to make the dogmas black and white, take away the questions, stop the conversation. I would put that under the rubric of a restorationist agenda. Put the world back together. Restore the old stabilities, the old convictions, the old verities. Out of that kind of thinking you get a metaphor for the church as club. The church is a club. It has its rules, like any club. If you want to belong, you obey the rules. If you don't obey the rules, get out. I find that a very, very inadequate way to think of the ecclesia, the community of the baptized, which we are. When I read the Gospels, I don't get the sense that that's what Jesus envisaged. However, that's what I've got. That's what I have to live with. That's where I have to thrive. That's where you have to thrive too. And you have basically two options, I think. One is to stay there, the other is to go. Get out. I refuse to get out. I am not going. Where else would I go? I'm a Catholic in my bones. This is my home. This messy, broken, wicked, wonderful institutional structure, the Roman Catholic Church, is my social home, my historical reality. The question then arises for me, how do I remain within this system and thrive? I'm not interested in just surviving. I want to thrive. And one of the things that has struck me just in my last 5 or so years, I believe that I am experiencing more freedom and more happiness as a Roman Catholic and as a priest than ever in my life before. And I do not understand why. Because I should be a very depressed, mean-minded, oppressed, sad individual, according to the way the world thinks. It doesn't quite work that way. I suspect part of it is that, as if by instinct, I've come to realize that my identity doesn't depend on that sociological, historical, political, economic reality, although it is my home. I'm a man of hope, not because I think we can conquer the problems, we can get it together. I'm a man of hope because my Redeemer lives. If I am to thrive, and I will, it is because I am grounded somewhere else. I'm in the church, but not of it. I can turn up repeatedly, constantly, persistently, and smile amidst the mess and the rubble of it all, and keep being faithful, I hope, because I'm grounded somewhere else. This raises the whole issue of our topic this morning. And let me move to the second preamble, some definitions, what I mean by some of the words that I use. I understand spirituality as being living relationships. It's about living relationships. It's commitment, it's work. And it's about living relationships. It's not about death-dealing relationships or defunct relationships. And it's about relationships with God, however you name God, with yourself, with other people, and with the rest of the cosmos, with things, events, what's going on around you. Spirituality is living relationship. To be human is to be involved in some kind of spirituality. Show me a person in whom there's nothing but deadly relationships, and I'll show you someone in whom spirituality has died. Show me someone, I don't care whether they're institutionalized or not, someone in whom there are living relationships, and I'll show you someone who's got a deep spirituality. Ideally, theoretically, because it's about living relationships, it goes in the direction of communion and community and other people, which sadly demands institution. Once you start linking up with others and seeking out a common end, you must form structure. That's where what I call religion happens. Religion is the concretization of spirituality. In myth, in symbol, in ritual, in creedal formula, in organizational structure. I think that spirituality that doesn't manifest itself in religion is truncated. It's not what it can be. And herein lies a huge problem for our culture and our times. We are a very privatized people. We look for our own individual benefits, our own comfort zone, as it were. There is no such thing as private spirituality. It does not exist. There's personal spirituality. But all spirituality demands community, seeks union, which involves structure, symbol, and ritual. And that's part of our challenge too, to find ways of being community, of being institutional. Mysticism, the mystical, is part of that. So incidentally, religion without spirituality is dead. Forget it. You can have all the symbols and all the rituals and all the dogmas and all the laws, and they can look very, very good and wonderful and respectable. But if there's no living relationships, what's the point? The relationships are the key to it. And they're fourfold: with God, however you name God, with yourself, with other people, and with the world at large. My definition of mysticism is to know and experience yourself as one with the one. To know yourself as a participator in life rather than a master of it. To know that if you are to be who you are called to be, it will always be in relationship. Oneness, unity, communion is given. We just are not aware. We haven't woken up to it. The spiritually aware person, the person who is awake, knows this unity, knows this communion, and allows it to emerge more and more strongly. We are all called, therefore, to be mystics. Every human being. We are called to know and experience the oneness of life and to live it and promote it. A little example before I move to the major part of my comment. Yesterday I had a conversation with one of the people that I admire most in the world, someone whom I look up to, a man who I believe to be a deeply human person, and he wouldn't like me saying it, but a genuine mystic. The man is an atheist. His name is Tom Uren. I don't know if you know Tom, but I've grown to love him dearly and look up to him and respect him. In fact, he said he wanted to come today, but he's not feeling well. He told me of, I don't know whether you've seen or heard of his speech at the Cowra anniversary of the breakout of the... He gave a speech there and recalled his own experience of the militarists, reiterated his comment, there is no progress in hate. If you think in terms of human beings as fundamentally relational beings and moving by nature towards communion, hatred is the very violation of that nature. It goes the other way. It's counter to our humanity. And the quality of our humanity is measured by the quality of our relationships. He sent me a copy of that speech, and he said, I sent one to Billy Hayden too. And he read me the letter that Bill Hayden wrote back, and it was the most beautiful letter. And apart from, I can't remember it all, and wouldn't be appropriate to quote it all, but the opening gambit was something like, Dear Tom, thank you for the words of the speech. You old bastard, you made me cry. So, the first point that I would like to make in this first session, I want to proceed by way of process, and I would like you, in your time this morning, to think of process. The first question that I think helps us along the path of understanding and becoming aware that we are one is to pursue the question, what do you want? Or to put it another way, what do you really want? And I would make a distinction between what I like and what I want. Let me give you an example. My parents are 83 years of age, and if you were to ask me, what should I buy my mother for her birthday on the 21st of December? Or if I was to ask Mum, what do you want for your birthday? She'd say, nothing, darling, just come and be with me. I think there's a lesson in that. That's a common experience. As people grow older, life actually simplifies. You want less and less. And in fact, you want to get rid of stuff. You want to disencumber yourself. There's a simplification of life which gets you down to what really matters. And the sooner we can learn that in our lives, the better. I think it's a mark of maturity to know what actually matters and to distinguish it from what doesn't matter. And part of that is knowing what you really want. A lot of us spend a lot of our time and energy pursuing things, thinking it is what we want, but it's not what we actually want, and we only discover it's not what we want when we get it. I have found it useful to make a distinction between what I like and what I want. What I like is an emotional thing. I like a peanut butter sandwich. Fresh bread with big chunks of cold butter on it. Now, if there's a doctor in the audience, they're probably wincing at this. And I'd have to say, well, that's what I like. Is that what I want? Taking into account my cardiovascular system and the possibility that it might bring on a stroke in the next year or two. Or take parents with young children. The kids are sick and they're crying. What would you like? Parents, if they were honest, would say, I would like to get out of the house and get away from this screaming child. What do you want? You want to do the good thing. You want the right thing. You want what is real. Want expresses who you are. Want is an expression of identity and vocation. Want, in the sense in which I'm expressing it, is about what I would call an existential must. You discover in your existence what you must do, and it is expression of who you are. And sometimes what you must do and what you actually want, therefore, in the depths of your being, is counter to what you feel like. It might be so counter to it, it creates an enormous conflict and pain for you. The classic example in the sacred scriptures is Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. I don't feel like going through with this. Luke even talks of Jesus sweating blood. This is a man in terror. He doesn't feel like this. His emotions are rebelling. But does he want the cross? Yes. Is that a sign of pathology and morbidity? No. He's not a necrophiliac. Everything in him rebels against that. Deep in his being, except deep in his being, what he wants is what is real and what is true and who he is. And in the tradition we talk about the will of God. It takes maturity in the whole process of purgation and detachment and sometimes bitter experiences to get us to a point of what we want. I would like you to pursue that question in the first session. By way of introductory comment into that, if we think of life as a conversation, an ongoing conversation, interaction, mutuality, seeking, searching, one of the important factors of a conversation is you don't know what's going to come out of the end of it. It's a world of difference between genuine conversation and in-house maintenance talk. You know exactly what's supposed to come out the end of in-house maintenance talk. Conversation has an openness about it. It's a yielding to something beyond the ideology and the thoughts and the arguments of the participants. There is something happening here. If we think of life as conversation, as opening up, as seeking, as searching, as becoming aware, and always seeking and searching and becoming aware, and never arriving. One of the dangers of the restorationist agenda is it kills conversation. It has arrived. It has the answers. And in that, I think it kills the human spirit. A challenge for us is to maintain conversation within the limited, actual, historical structures that we find and we call the ecclesia, the church. I have a quotation there on the handout from John Paul II from his encyclical Ut Unum Sint, which I think is not only courageous but profoundly insightful document. And so if you examine that particular paragraph, I find John Paul II a conundrum. I think, as the tablet pointed out there a couple of years ago, it's almost like there are two people there. There's the Polish cultural man who seems to be caught in a time warp, but there's the visionary, and there's a man who's a deep thinker. And it's the second aspect of the man that comes through here. He quotes Gaudium et Spes in the middle of that quotation. We cannot fully find ourselves except through a sincere gift of ourselves. That statement alone is worth pondering. And then he goes on to say, dialogue, conversation, interaction, this searching, this longing, is an indispensable step along the path toward human self-realization. The self-realization both of individual and every human community. There is no building of community without this. Ideologies, you cannot have a conversation with an ideologue because they've already got the answers. The end is already given. You can have an argument with them. You may have a debate with them. You won't have a conversation with them. You will not be able to enter into dialogue in which the Holy Father talks about it here. If we are to find our way through and become a pilgrim people, as we are called to be, there has to be an open-endedness. There has to be some honest doubt, uncertainty, even confusion. But when you've got people who are keen to relate and are aware of the oneness and the communion of life, you can accommodate an enormous amount of uncertainty. You don't have to have the answers. You don't have to have it all locked up. A little bit further down, John Paul II points out this dialogue is not just an intellectual thing. It's not just about making distinctions and getting intellectual insights and defining things. He calls it a global existential dimension, the deep, primitive, if you like, human reality that draws us together to seek communion. It involves the human subject in his or her entirety. Dialogue between communities involves in a particular way the subjectivity of each. You might like to pursue that later on, and I hope these sheets will be something you'll put behind one of those magnets on the fridge and come back to it later on. The second point is that of listening. St. Benedict begins his rule with that word, listen. And a few lines further on he says, listen with the ears of your heart. Become an attentive person. This is the essence of the contemplative life. And this is the pathway, I think, or one of the pathways to the mystical, to finding yourself one with others. If you are constantly thoughtless, non-reflective, not paying attention, you're probably not going to connect with others. Imagine, if you will, two people trying to form a relationship, say husband and wife, and each is caught up in what they must do and intent on doing it with great energy and great purpose. Surely they're going to need to stop and listen to one another from time to time. And surely part of the essence, a necessary fact in building a relationship, is that they do that listening constantly. And people who've committed themselves to relationship over a period of time, it becomes part of the warp and woof of their life, that listening, that paying attention. And it's tragic to see what happens to relationships when the listening stops. Typically people grow apart. They can't access one another anymore. I don't know who you are. Dag Hammarskjöld, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, said, let me read with open eyes the book my days are writing. The epiphany of creation, the revelation of God that's happening in every moment, from a broken shoelace and a missed bus to a lovely encounter with a friend, a bottle of wine, a sunny day, a headache. Let me read with open eyes the book my days are writing. And Maria Boulding, English nun, writes very beautifully, like Jesus, you have to listen and listen. It will take you all your life. What, to know what you must do? No. To hear the Father's word of love for you. Isn't that a beautiful way to describe? That's obedience. That's the life of obedience. That's the life of listening and attentiveness. All right. I've got a couple of exercises which I've listed there, and I'd encourage you, you need to do them if you don't want to. Obviously, I'm not going to check up on you. But what I'd encourage you to do is to do the first one and take about half an hour or so to do that, or 20 minutes, whatever. And then this, I think it's fairly straightforward. Just reflecting, ask yourself the question, stay with what comes. What do I really want? As distinct from what I like, what do I really want? The second exercise complements that, and you'll find some scriptural quotations to use on the back of the sheet. Places in the Gospels where that turn of phrase is used. What do you want? And it's different in each instance. And don't expect to find the answer this morning. The point is not the answer, but the asking, the questing in the question. To listen, because out of that experience of what you want, my assumption is that what you want and what I want is communion, is oneness, is love, to love and be loved. And the problem with my life is that it's not yet awake enough in me. And I have to keep listening and paying attention so that my whole life becomes consumed by that desire to love and be loved. And in that way, actually experience the oneness that is my lot. Become a mystic. So, we gather here again at 11 o'clock. Remain here, wander, make yourself absolutely at home. Pursuing our theme of recovering the mystical heart of our faith, I'd like to now focus on the Bible, the nature of the Bible and the nature of our tradition. One of the most remarkable features of the way Jesus dealt with people was he told stories. That's very much part of the Jewish tradition and the culture of that time, but he could have done otherwise had he chosen. He didn't. He told stories. And if you think about it, stories are always open-ended. Stories are never definitive. You can come back to a good story again and again and again and again, and they can open up worlds of meaning and wisdom for you. Another thing Jesus did was something I think the Irish inherited from him. He answered a question with a question. Very often when Jesus was asked a question, they try and trap him. A good example of it is that wonderful scene where it's in each of the three synoptics. They're crowding around the place where Jesus is and he's teaching. So this fellow is brought in, he's paralyzed, and his four mates bring him along on some kind of a stretcher. They can't get in, so they rip the house apart and lower him down. And the Pharisees say, what do you think you're doing healing this man? You have no right to do that. Jeff Robertson makes the point that Jesus responds with a question and tries to get those people to ask the right question. The right question is not why are you doing it, but who are you? And if you understand who Jesus is, you won't need to ask that second question. Jesus has got a sense of his identity. The religious authorities have no sense of it. One ways into understanding what God is doing through Jesus is to look at the moments of abrasion and conflict where the religious authorities run into Jesus and say, why are you doing this? And where Jesus runs into them and said, why are you doing what you're doing? Clearly they have a different worldview. And I've handed out a sheet there entitled The Cleansing of the Temple. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But first of all, some general comments. The exercise that I invited you to do in that first session was to listen, pay attention to what's going on with you. The most practical and the most fundamental question you can ask at any moment of any time is what's happening. With yourself, with other people, say in a relationship, keep an eye, keep an ear to what's actually happening. Not what you would like to be happening, but what is happening. And that means you have to listen and wait upon the situation and let the truth of it lead you. And sometimes the truth is embarrassing because you think what is happening is such and such, but it's not actually. What is happening is this. So paying attention and listening to human experience is absolutely critical. A theme that I constantly repeat in my spirituality classes is that experience is the great teacher. One of the mistakes we have made within our own Catholic tradition and probably in other Christian traditions is that we've presented people with Christianity as an ideology. Here is the schema. There you will find what it means to be a good man, a good woman, a good housewife, a good husband. Now go and do it. Very little, if any, attention was paid to what was happening. What's going on with me? A good example, when I went through the seminary in the 1960s, I first went to Toongabbie in 1965. Ironically, Toongabbie has become a place of restoration, I hear on the grapevine. But there was nobody ever asked me or implied or suggested that I pursue the question, Michael, what's going on with you? There was a system, an ideology presented. This is what it means to be the good priest, the good Maris. Now, and here's the structure, now go and do it. When in fact life is conversation, and the other part of that conversation was missing. You were expected to just behave, and if you did behave in the right way, you were ordained. For better or for worse. And I can tell you, 10 years after ordination, I went through quite a crisis because I was wondering, was it for worse? Maybe I'd stumbled into something without reflection, and maybe I was in the wrong place. But that's a whole other story. I didn't discover that I was in the wrong place. Getting back to the Bible as story, again, in reading the Bible, remember that so much of what is there is actually an expression of human experience. And it can be very misleading if we proclaim the word in the assembly and then finish with, this is the word of the Lord. I'm not suggesting we change that, but it can be misleading if we don't know what's going on. Let me give you an example. In the book of Judges, and I can't give you the exact reference, but there is in the weekday cycle, I think it happens during Lent, the story of the Jewish leader going out to fight kings, as they seem to do ad nauseam in those days and in our own day. And anyway, the Jewish king was about to get whipped. So he said, Yahweh, deliver us in this battle, and I will offer to you the first thing that I see when I get home. I mean, this is classic mythology stuff. So they, lo and behold, they win the battle. Yahweh delivers the enemy, and they slaughter them and cut their guts out and strew them all over the desert. And they come home, and who should come out to meet the victorious king but his daughter, his unmarried daughter. And he said, oh, woe is me, I'm going to have to kill her. And she says, well, don't worry, Dad, I'll go to the mountains and mourn my virginity for 3 months, and then you can do it, which he does. This is the word of the Lord. Now, there is a temptation. The immediate temptation is, get rid of those dirty, those ugly, those tacky stories, those stories of violence and viciousness. I say, hang on, that's us. This is our story. And the word, God is speaking in that. God has promised, I shall be with you. In all that tacky, violent, hateful, vicious, dishonest, wicked stuff, don't you ever forget that I am with you. And keep remembering how tacky you can be. And as one author says, the Bible rubs our noses in it again and again and again. And it's well for us to face the fact. What is the big story in the Old Testament? The story of the Exodus. Nothing is written before the Exodus, everything is written after it and in the light of it. Now when I say nothing is written before it, there are stories like the story of creation and so forth that belong to other cultures and predate Exodus by some centuries. But nothing is gathered in the Bible and written down that this is our book of stories, except in the light of the Exodus. It is the pivotal story. In the New Testament, it's exactly the same. Everything is written after the new Exodus and in the light of it. It is written back to front. When the story ends, they turn around then and write as if they're writing it from the beginning, knowing how it is going to end. The new Exodus is Jesus' Passover. Jesus is the new Moses. The new desert is Calvary. What happens in this story? It's a classic story of redemption. And as mythologists and writers of history and peoples and culture and so forth will point out, there are lots of redemptive type stories in cultures. And if you look at most movies, they are typically about redemption. Goodies and baddies and goodies triumphing. Mostly. But so there's something coming out of human experience here, human longing, human searching. The Exodus story, the great pivotal event of the Old Testament, at first blush, looks like God intervenes. These people are politically and socially and economically and culturally oppressed, and God intervenes and says, there you are, now we'll start afresh. I don't think that is the essence of the Exodus story. think that is an essential chapter in the story, but it brings the people to the essential story, which only happens in the desert. How does God deal with the oppression of Pharaoh? God takes the people out. Get away from there. And incidentally, that rescue could have been done by human means. Anyone with enough military might or whatever. So what's special to God? What depends on God in this is what happens in the desert. And here we're getting to the mystical heart of our faith. What happens in the desert is a covenant of...
Have you ever heard the expression cold as charity? Mm. Why do people say, I mean, charity is a wonderful thing? Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, and why? I think it's tied up with this more in... Because somebody says, I don't want your charity, thank you. Well, we instinctively want charity, but what are they rejecting? It lacks the warmth. I think, yes, it's too full of ego. And the whole point of Christ-likeness is to empty that out. Let me draw on my own experience in the seminary, where I think a lot of, within our Catholic tradition, a lot of so-called Christian virtue was promoted implicitly at the level of functional ambition. You can do it. Okay. Michael's a young seminarian. There's lots of virtues he needs to grow in, but we'll focus on patience this month. And the suggestion was, pick a virtue and focus on it and sort of work at it and till you master it. Okay, so patience. Now, we began the day with what used to be called, and this is an adaptation and a bad adaptation of St. Ignatius of Loyola, with what was called examination of foresight. So at 5:30 in the morning when you went to the chapel, you reflected on the day, and okay, patience is my thing this month. So now where might I be likely to be tested today with patience? Well, I'm on stewarding at breakfast. I'm on with Joe. Yeah, he drives me mad. Okay, that's one place. Well, when I'm working with Joe, I'll smile and I'll... And then we've got the second class today is metaphysics, and I hate metaphysics, or more particularly, I hate this particular lecture, and that's going to try my patience. And so it goes. So I foresee these times, and I brace myself, as it were, prepare myself, and work out a way of... I say a little prayer, and I will let a smile come to my face, and in that way I will grow in patience and become a veritable pain in the arse in the process, because it's all about me. So at the end of the month I can say, I've grown in patience this month, and all I've done is develop some strategies for covering up issues, instead of saying, well, what the hell's going on with you, Michael? Why are you impatient? What is it about Joe that gets to you? Think about that. Maybe you need to talk to Joe. This is trying to short-circuit it with something called the virtue of patience, and it's got nothing to do with patience. More properly, our genuine virtues, Christian virtues concerned, are matters of aspiration. We aspire to be patient, to be kind, to be generous, to be compassionate, to be merciful. And the thing about these dispositions is that they are gifts. It is not within my power to be patient. Patience, kindness, mercy, these are the fruits of the Spirit. These are expressions of God. These are other names for grace, for God's presence. What I can do is facilitate, get out of the way, do things to listen and become aware of the obstacles and deal with the obstacles, but I cannot become patient beyond me. Now, this applies very much more with the disposition of forgiveness. I think we go hugely wrong with this one. You and I cannot forgive. So we're supposed to forgive, yes? We're supposed to be, we're the vessels of clay within which this great mystery is at work. when I am hurt and I need to forgive, if I approach it in a functional way, I say, right, how am I going to forgive this person? Well, I'll go and see them and say, I forgive you. There as your virtue. I would much rather say, hang on, let's look at the issue, feel the pain of it, pray for that person, listen to what's going on, deal with it in whatever way you can, and maybe one day you will grow into that issue, but that disposition whereby God, if that happens, then it will be genuine forgiveness. It won't be forgiveness through gritted teeth. It won't be ego mastery. We're not talking about mastery mode when we talk about Christian dispositions. We're talking about grace. We're talking about God at work within us. With regard to forgiveness, emotionally, I may never forgive that person. If that person has profoundly hurt me, that feeling of hurt might disappear 3 hours after the last clod is dropped on my coffin. That might be the reality of it. I may go through life honestly hating that person, but nothing to do with the moral issue of forgiveness. Michael, I've cut you out a couple of times there, but where's the... Oh!
I was just reflecting on the anchorites in the desert, how they had the noonday devil.
Oh, yeah.
When they'd structured such a spiritual way of life. And if they had it, God help us all.
Absolutely. And the more you enter this field, I think the more... Mary, was, while people are finding their seats, was there anything further you wanted to continue with that?
When you said the situation like, let's try and be patient.
Yes.
Well, try and being patient. So whether it's you in the seminary or anyone anywhere
Yes.
else, I'm just talking about my experience. For me, trying to be patient in different situations in my life, I felt it was more being submissive. And
okay.
I was just saying it's another way of looking at patience. And
Not a terribly helpful one, though, is it? Really?
no, well, you don't
Unless you understand
from it.
submissive or submission in the sense in which I was talking about it, submitting to the reality, because when we're impatient, we're really fighting against what is, aren't we? We're refusing to submit.
But I was just saying how it was for me.
Yes.
Like being patient was, trying to be patient was actually like being submissive.
Yeah. That's it. Paul and I were just talking about the kind of virtuous person that is the result of... See, I think you get all kinds of distortions of virtue when it's rationally figured out, and then George Maloney, a Jesuit, I don't know whether any of you have come across George Maloney's writings, but I was at a lecture he was giving, and he must have been in some kind of a naughty mood, because he said, we Jesuits promoted a spirituality that was like spirituality by numbers. See Jesus, run like Jesus. Sort of, you figure it all out. This is what it is. This is what the good Christian mother is, the good Catholic priest, whatever, and these are the virtues. Now do it. And it's all written in the manuals. And it was a manual approach to the spiritual life that we were given, and we passed it on to you from the pulpit and in catechetic classes and so forth. And you not only get that ego-based life, and the more successful it is, the bigger a failure it is, because some of the meanest people I know were virtuous in this sense. They conquered themselves. It was more like a bad form of stoicism than genuine Christian virtue. But you also got bad understandings of virtue and people being manipulated to be submissive, rather than genuinely virtuous. Whereas if you keep virtue at this level of aspirations, that is, it's not something within your control. You can't be patient in any mastery sense. You can't forgive in any mastery. It's very practically helpful, and we'll pick up the whole issue of forgiveness when it comes to memory and remembering. But just very briefly, it does help if you're confronted with deep hurt that somebody has done to you, And your well-meaning brothers and sisters say, but Mary, what you've got to do is forgive and forget. I'm going to say now, and when we talk about memory, remember and forgive. But what does forgiveness mean? I cannot forgive. All I can do is make myself available to the grace. And psychologically, my lack of forgiveness, psychological feelings of hatred and anger and frustration and sadness and all that, I might take those to the grave with me through no fault of my own. Some people are very badly hurt by other human beings or by life. And it is an insult to them and an added burden to them to say that you've got to forgive because Jesus says forgive. And it's a misrepresentation of the gospel, misrepresentation of genuine virtue. Yep.
I'm wondering to what extent that is a real distinction with the difference. You're saying you haven't got to forgive, but you've got to make yourself available to the grace of forgiveness.
All right.
Can you just tease out that distinction?
Okay. I think the simplest thing I can say, Paul, is that if I adopt the mastery mode and make forgiveness an ambition, forgiveness will be my focus. I've got to forgive, and I will have a predefinition of what forgiveness looks like, which I think is a mistake. If I take the facilitative mode of aspirations, I focus not on forgiving, though I desire forgiveness. I focus on listening. What's going on with me? So I feel hurt. I feel hatred in my heart. And listen and pay attention to that and lift that up to God. And it might be that I need to talk with somebody about that. So by facing that, I'm actually working through the issues. I'm actually facilitating the possibility of space being created for grace to work, for me being overtaken by forgiveness, which will come as gift and as surprise, and it will look different and feel different from what I actually anticipated. Mari?
I think there's a wonderful couple of exercises in Anthony de Mello's book. One of them is celebrating the sorrowful mysteries of my life and release from resentment, both of those. And it's just got to, really looking at what does the hurt point to, and to really not escape from it, but to stay with it. And then he has a suggestion that, you just then look at the crucifixion.
Love is forged. God says, you will be my people and I will be your God. I shall be with you forever. If you go to Exodus chapter 1 Exodus chapter 3 verses 1 through 15, the burning bush, God and Moses have their encounter. God says, go, Moses, and tell Pharaoh to set my people free. And Moses asks a fairly obvious question, well, who are you? Who shall I say sent me? And there are two key parts, John Courtney Murray says, to that revelation. One is the promise, I am with you. And the other is the befuddling name, I am who I am, Moses, which is no name, which is like, say, mind your own business. If you put those together, it's almost like a revelation that says, I shall be there as who I am, shall I be there. Where God is, God does. And God's doing is always loving. And God's loving is always liberating. And this is what the people encounter in the desert. And there's a whole something else, a whole other oppression begins to emerge in the desert. And that is dealt with not by taking them out of the desert, but by taking them into it, the place of death. This oppressor is dealt with through dying. Come with me, and this is how the love grows. And that's what it's about. Restoration of love, not restoration of rules. A gathering together of that which has been set asunder. The Exodus story is pivotal, and the same structure unfolds in the New Testament. In the text which I've given you, the cleansing of the temple, I don't think you can understand what happens there, and it's very significant that it's all four Gospels, including John, write about this. They write about it in very differing ways, which in an odd manner actually confirms the notion that it actually happened. We are dealing here with a historical fact, if they all had exactly the same words and exactly the same description, you say, well, one of them wrote it and they all copied it. But it's very different if you look at it. But before we look at what the Gospels write about this incident, I'd refer you to the flip side of the sheet, the words of the prophet Jeremiah and the words of the prophet Isaiah. What is the role of the prophet? It's a very simple one. To help the people to remember. Prophets are particularly raised up in times of forgetfulness. And incidentally, we're all called to the prophetic vocation. We're all called to live in mindfulness, to remember, and to help each other to remember. That is the prophetic vocation. But at times of mass forgetfulness, or in times of individual forgetfulness, the prophetic word, the prophetic example puts us back in focus, helps us to remember the story, the principal reality that is unfolded in the story of Exodus. It is a story of love. It is a story of covenant. It is a story of liberation through being loved. It is a story of reconciliation. Throughout the Old Testament, the great prophets keep being raised up because the people keep forgetting. You'll find in that particular account, the gospel accounts of Jesus cleansing the temple, very clear echoes of Jeremiah and Isaiah. For the gospel writers, Jesus is a prophet. He's more than a prophet, but he is a prophet. He reminds the people of the essence of the story. It's about a covenant of love. All the rules, all the rituals, all the buildings, all the institutional structures, essential as they are, have one purpose and one purpose only. That is to serve the primacy of relationships. And the primacy of relationships finds its context within the covenant. I would suggest to you that if you read the Gospels and you look at those moments of abrasion and conflict between Jesus and the religious authority, this is what is at stake. A very simple division. The religious authorities had let the means become the ends. The rituals, the laws, the rules had become what mattered. People and relationships, and most importantly the covenant, became secondary. And it's happened generation after generation after generation after generation since. And it will go on happening generation after generation after generation. It's an interesting question. Why do we human beings mistake means for ends so persistently, so predictably? I think it's got something to do with anxiety and the fact that if you've got a set of rules and regulations, a nice system, it allays the anxiety. It establishes the illusion of control. If you give primacy to relationships, if you say the covenant is what matters, you're in the uncharted wastelands of the desert. And you will die there unless you are in close and intimate relationship with the one who has the chart, who has the map. So we make our own maps, our own sets of rules. Little observation. It seems to me that when you go down the path of giving primacy to rules and dogmas and institutional structures, and again, let me stress, they are essential. We've got to have them. But they're not primary. They serve relatedness. But if you make them primary, one of the symptoms of that focus on rules and regulations is exclusivity. You start to exclude people. You start to come up with club images of the church. You're either in or you're out. There's a line in the sand. Which side are you on? If you focus on relationships, you are inclined to be inclusive, and you will do anything to keep people from being excluded. Two of the great stories of the Gospels are found in Luke, and only in Luke. The story of the Good Samaritan, so-called, and the story of the two lost sons, sometimes referred to as the prodigal son. Look closely at those two stories, and I think you'll find a pattern that is in all the stories Jesus tells about the primacy of relationships. What matters is that this son of mine, who has done a dreadful thing, but he's home. He's back with us. He's in relationship.
problem with the other lost son, and the other son is actually more lost than the younger son. The elder son is more lost, but he's the righteous one. He's obeyed all the rules. He stayed at home. And the father says, come on in, celebrate, your brother is at home. And he said, I've slaved for you all these years. Isn't that loaded? And if you go to the beginning of that chapter 15 of Luke, you'll find a very, very simple contextual statement. The sinners and tax collectors were seeking his company, and the religious authorities said, why do you welcome all these people? Jesus is saying, in effect, because these people need to be welcomed. They've gotten out of relationship. Jesus' focus, I believe, is always the covenant, the primacy of relationship. He doesn't dismiss rules, but he makes them secondary. In this particular passage, then, we looked at Jeremiah, and I won't read all that passage, I'll leave you to read it, but little statements like Jeremiah, this passage comes from about the time of the destruction of the temple at the beginning of the 6th century BC, about 587. The temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and the people were sent into exile. This, incidentally, is the origin of the Samaritans. They were the people that were gathered around there. So when the Jews came home, they didn't come home to an empty land and empty places. They came home to a people who was already established. But Jeremiah, throughout the prophet, he keeps trying to say, come back to the covenant. Live in fidelity to God who has chosen you. So Jeremiah is instructed, stand in the gate of the Lord's house. Here is Jesus in the gate of the Lord's house. And the structure of the temple was such that it had an outer courtyard as well as an inner part. Jeff Robinson points out, and I think he's onto something here, where in Mark's rendition, the word temple is mentioned 3 times there. It says, he entered the temple and began to drive at those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers, etc., where anyone could carry anything through the temple. And at the end of that first paragraph, in the words of the prophet Jeremiah, Jeremiah is instructed to say, do not trust in these deceptive words. This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. And Mark seems to be echoing that. And Jeff also points out that what Jesus is saying, that this area, which was legitimately set aside to buy and sell, and as marketplaces in those days went, it was a fairly honest, well-ordered one. But there is something happening here. There is a focus being lost. There's a forgetfulness being generated. So, back to Jeremiah. The issue with Jeremiah is not that these people aren't obeying rules. These people are living in forgetfulness of the covenant. He says, for if you truly amend your ways and your doings, if you truly act justly with one another. That, Gerhard von Rad, who's probably one of the preeminent Old Testament scholars of the 20th century, says, justice is the key to the Old Testament thinking. The Hebrew word tzedakah. And he said it doesn't mean measuring up to an ethical ideal, it means right relationship. So in effect, what Jeremiah is saying, you should truly be in right relationship one with another. And that will be a manifestation of, and will be demanded of you by, your right relationship with God. You're living in the covenant. It occurs to me, just making a slight digression here and going back to what we're looking at in the first session, we would be much better off environmentally if we were mystics. In other words, if we were in right relationship, not only with ourselves and with the more than, the transcendent God, however you name it, and with one another and with God's creation. Why does consumerism work? Why do we buy things we don't need? I think it's because we're anxious. We're not in right relationship with ourselves. So we do things compulsively. We don't know what we want. We think we want things. This is why there's so many garage sales around. And then he goes on, don't oppress the alien, the orphan, and the widow, or shed innocent blood in this place. And if you do not go after other gods, to your own hurt.
then I will dwell with you in this place. The great promise, I am with you. And it's not, the issue is not that it may be stated as if it's saying, well, God's left us. The issue is that people have become deaf. They've ceased to be present to God. And the question that God asks Adam in that primordial story of the fall and creation, where are you, is very closely related to the question, what do you want? God comes seeking those who have been made as companions to walk in the cool of the evening, and they have broken the relationship. And the broken relationship and the attempts to restore the relationship are at the heart of the unfolding revelation, the story that is in the Old Testament and New Testament. God's presence, God in our midst, seeking to love us into freedom. That is, to bring us back into right relationship with ourselves and other people. That's the heart of it. There is absolutely nothing that you or I can do that will make God love us more or less. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Well, tick, 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 tick. Why be a good person then? Why behave yourself? Surely I behave myself so that God... Hang on, no, that doesn't sound right, does it? Morality. What is a moral? What constitutes the moral person? The moral person is one who seeks the good, who seeks the true, who seeks the beautiful. The moral person is one who is in right relationships and seeks to promote relatedness. Not because God will reward them, but because that's who they are. It's an expression of your being. And that's how you will be happy. That's how you will be fulfilled. That's why you were made. You don't be moral so that God will love you. If that's at stake, go ahead and be immoral. God will still love you. Not the issue. Isn't it true we've forgotten this? I don't know what your experience in growing up Catholic or growing up Christian in the 20th century was or has been, but certainly part of my experience was the sense, I don't ever remember hearing it said, but I think it lurked there, that if you don't behave yourself, you won't be loved. And I think that is an abomination. There is no basis for that in a right interpretation of sacred scripture. The heart of the story is a loving, searching God who simply wants to love us into freedom. Another way of talking about morality in this context from the Bible is this: as you have been loved into freedom, go into the world so that God may love others into freedom through you. That's Christian, that's biblical morality. And note, I chose those words very carefully. As you have been loved into freedom. That's making a giant assumption. Have you? Do you experience religion in that way, as an experience of being loved into freedom? Or is it an ideology? Is it a system? As you have been loved into freedom, it presupposes covenant, relationship, primacy of relationship. And that's not a definitive once and for all. That's a way of living. As you are being loved into freedom might be a better way to actually couch that. Go into the world. Go into the world with confidence. Not to love the world. Don't try and love the world. Let God love people through you. Your vocation is to be the place where God enters the world. Get out of the way. Empty yourself. Stop trying to be virtuous. Let God love people through you, with you. Back to Jeremiah here. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel. And whenever you hear that, I am the God of Israel. Thus says the Lord of hosts. That is a mnemonic. That is a prophetic word to the Jewish consciousness. And we must all be Jewish. You can't be a Christian unless you're Jewish. What is it a reminder of? The Exodus story. I am the one who brought you out of Egypt. I am the one who said, I shall be with you. I want to form a relationship with you. I want to love you into freedom. And this is getting very practical. Add your burnt offerings to your sacrifices and eat the flesh. For in the day that I brought your ancestors out of the land of Egypt, I didn't speak to them or command them concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices. But this command I gave them, obey my voice. And the essence of obedience is listening, attentive seeking out of a truthful relationship. Hear and heed me, and I will be your God, and you shall be my people, and walk only in the way that I command you, so that it may be well with you. Going back to Jesus and the cleansing of the temple, he is encountering here a whole forgetfulness of the essential thing. Do you think Jesus is opposed to the temple as such? I don't think so. He went there. He went to the temple to pray. He went to the temple to hear the word proclaimed. I believe the issue is that the means has become the end. The covenantal relationship as primary has been usurped by rules as primary. And he's fed up. And he actually gets very, very physical. Luke, dear gentle medical Luke, says it very nicely and as it were glosses over it a bit. He just says, he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling things there. If we had just that testimony, we wouldn't know much about it at all. Matthew and Mark add a little bit more. They say began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple, and he overturned the tables and the money changers. Hang on, this is a bit more violent, a bit more angry, a bit more physical than Luke would have us believe. And then John. And note where John situates it in his story. Mark and Matthew and Luke have it in the Jerusalem ministry. The story is coming to a conclusion. This is a point of conflict when Jesus turns up in Jerusalem and they're about to execute him. John has it right at the beginning of his gospel. Now, you might wonder why that is, and I don't know why that is, but I can only guess that it is a highly significant event for John, that this flavours the telling of the story. You might ask the question, and I hope I'm not just being mischievous in saying this, what would happen if Jesus turned up today? Would he have occasion to do this? And if he did, how might we respond? John gives a lengthy account of this and emphasises the violence of it, actually. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, none of the others mention that, making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. You can imagine the scene. For these others, he doesn't say, Luke, Matthew and Mark don't say sort of he cleared the area. Luke has him just drive them out. Mark and Matthew says he drove them out and he overturned the furniture and the seats of those who sold doves. But here he gets rid of the lot. The cattle, you can imagine doves going some, whatever, people running away, he's throwing furniture over. Now, it's only one man, obviously it's a fairly huge space, several hundred metres, so we don't have to believe he did the whole thing. But he certainly made a scene, according to John. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace. The others use a word which means a place of thievery, brigandage, and so forth. And that brings us to, I think it's Isaiah that actually mentions that. Is it? Anyway, let's look at Isaiah. This is quite beautiful. Mark is the only one who has, if you like, a universal reference here to the story. And it's something that comes up already in Isaiah chapter 56. This part of Isaiah post-dates the actual prophet Isaiah by some time. Isaiah fades out of the books about the year 700 BC. He's an 8th century prophet. So this particular piece from chapters 56 and following 6 or 8 chapters are sometimes referred to as 3rd Isaiah, and it's after the exile. And there's, if you like, with a small c, a catholicity that comes in here. Maintain justice, again, that right relationship, and do what is right, for soon my salvation will come and my deliverance be revealed. Happy is the one who does this, the one who holds it fast, who keeps the Sabbath, not profaning it. And keeping the Sabbath is not about a rule, a regulation. It's about celebrating the creation and the Creator and remembering the promise, I am with you. Do not let the foreigner joined to the Lord say, the Lord will surely separate me from his people. Hear carefully what he's saying. Don't let the foreigner joined to the Lord. That's a very, very radical thing to be said by the Jews who saw themselves as a closed group, typically. And here's the foreigner joined to the Lord. And do not let the eunuch say, I'm just a dry tree. It's a very poignant statement. The man is incapable of begetting offspring. For thus says the Lord to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose the things that please me, and hold fast my covenant, I will give in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. The prophet is bypassing all the visible signs of success, all the signs of reputation in society, and saying there's something much deeper here in my covenant, in the relationship I've forged with people. And the foreigners who join themselves to the Lord to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord and to be his servants, all who keep the Sabbath, do not profane it, and hold fast my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted in my altar. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. It's only Mark that actually picks that up. Thus says the Lord God, who gathers the outcasts of Israel, I will gather others to them besides those already gathered. The reference to the has this house which is called by my name become a den of robbers? That's in the middle of the Jeremiah text. The point is that the Gospels, and clearly these people saw themselves as part of an ongoing history, part of the Jewish tradition. And Jesus is in the great prophetic tradition, but he brings something, and I think the point of conflict here is a point of revelation. That Jesus is not condemning the rules and regulations. What he's condemning is the belief that they are primary. The rules and regulations, the temple and all those structures serve the covenant relationship. And it's not surprising that Jesus should have reached out to the halt and the lame, the downtrodden, the poor and the needy, because they don't fit the system. And the system is presented as an end in itself, and these people are therefore left out of the covenant, and that's not right. Let's leave it there. And the question is a very good one and spot on in my experience, and it concerns the ancient teaching, which is very biblically based and strong within the Greek and the Eastern tradition, but largely forgotten in the Western tradition. The Greek word theosis is that we are made to become God. Actually, Augustine has something like that. God became human so that we might become divine. Irenaeus is very strong on it, but you'll find it in the Cappadocian fathers too, Gregory of Nyssa and so forth, Basil. Look, I can only agree with you that there is so much that has been lost because we have lost touch with the mystical heart of our faith. Once you start to move in the direction of giving primacy to rules and dogmas, that has ramifications all over the place. And one of them is in terms of catechesis and evangelization and proclamation of the word. Typically, what I think tends to happen is that the proclaimer, the preacher and the teacher of the word becomes the proclaimer of an ideology rather than the bearer of good news, who engages people in a process of mutual conversation, bearing in mind that God has made us in his image and likeness. And that's a stupendous revelation, that my being bears the mark, is a spark of the divine fire. It is an expression of the divine, and that's my destiny. Words fail us, actually, and it can be perhaps a little bit misleading and even deadening. Say, well, yeah, we are made to become God. What does it mean? Our liturgy is supposed to manifest this, and again, I think the liturgy in the West has let us down somewhat, and we're still struggling to find our way through to that, aren't we? The dignity of being baptized. What does it mean to be baptized? I found it very, very helpful in reading St. Ignatius of Antioch's letter to the community at Smyrna. Now you might say, yes, Michael, tell us more about the Christians at Smyrna. But Ignatius, remember, Antioch was the place where Christians were first called Christians. And Ignatius, we don't know anything about him really, except that he was taken prisoner by the Romans and transported through Asia Minor to Rome, where he was martyred about the year 110. On his way, he wrote 7 magnificent letters to the communities along the way, including one to Polycarp, his dear friend, who had been a disciple of John. But in addressing the community in Smyrna, he makes a statement which I think is worth a lot of meditation, that where there is the presence of Jesus Christ, there you have the ecclesia that is Catholic, with a small c. There you have the worldwide ecclesia. The worldwide gathering is constituted by the presence of Jesus Christ. And coming back to that baptismal identity, we are baptized into Christ. Therein lies the unfolding of our identity, and it is to become divine. It's a divinization. Hominization is divinization. That's our teaching. That's our faith. And you're right, we don't hear it. You don't hear much about the mystics either from the pulpit, do you? Or the mystical heart of our faith is not proclaimed. We've got to recover it. Well, that's an excellent point. We must remember that our expressions about God, who is unnameable, incomprehensible, and we're made in the image and likeness of the unnameable and incomprehensible. Therefore, everything we say is pathetic, terribly inadequate, and words and images keep bumping into each other. The man who started the Aquinas Academy, Doc Woodbury, gave the first lecture there on March 7th, 1945. Just for the record, it'll be our 60th anniversary next year, so we'll be having some celebrations, and you're all welcome. But he said, our language about God will always be likey, naughty, mory. And by analogy, our language about ourselves, about the human person, will always be likey, naughty, mory. That is, remember, whatever you say, for example, God is love. What you're actually saying is, God is like that. Look in that direction. Get on the platform that points in the direction of love, towards that horizon. Not the platform that says hate. Don't look across that horizon. You want to understand God. Get on the platform pointing towards the horizon of love. Orient yourself that way. But remember, God is not love. God is more than love. Take it one step further. We talk about existence, being. God exists. Well, get on the platform that points towards the horizon of being, not the horizon of non-being, the horizon of being. Look towards that horizon, but God is like what you're naming there, but God is not that. God is more than that. In a very real sense, God doesn't exist. God is more than existence. So that our language falls far short. When we cross the line, when we go over into that area of depth of humanity, we start to use metaphor and symbol and ritual and paradoxes encountered and ambiguity. And the more deeply you go into this arena, the more you just fall silent and resort to awe and reverence. And you say, it can't be spoken. It can't be uttered. And in the Jewish tradition, I think they keep this alive much more readily. You don't say the name Yahweh, except at certain very, very specific times, and only certain people can say it. Because you'll get into the habit, if you know the name, and this was the instance with Moses at the burning bush. Once you know the name, we human beings think knowledge is power. I know the name, therefore I know where it is, what it does, and that's got rid of Yahweh. Now, what else? And to maintain a sense of ignorance is very important. Agnosticism. occasionally hear people say, I think simplistic Jesus is the answer. I think Jesus is the question. That's a much better way to think of who and what Jesus is, what God is doing here. It's what do you want? Where are you? How will you respond? Will you accept the invitation to love and be loved? And we must avoid at all costs the reductionism that is very much part of our mentality, that somehow or other out there is a formula, out there is a name, out there is a label, and you can get it all together. It's the danger when you are forced to go into a classroom and teach the faith. Very, very tempting to come up with a little package. I'm seriously contemplating at the moment giving a course next year at the Aquinas Academy. A title for the timing is something like Catholicism, a vision for living. And I'll advertise it as for non-lapsed Catholics, jaded Catholics and old hands, something like that. And I will also say, I'm not going to give you answers. We're not about developing a new apologetic or a new ideology, but a way of envisioning the world and ourselves in the world. A way of thinking that is, I think, in our tradition, but we've tended to lose it. And it's the sort of thing we've been looking at this morning. I can't emphasize enough the primacy of relationships versus the primacy of what I would generally call details. You cross that boundary to the primacy of details, and you're well and truly on the slippery slope to legalism, dogmatism, and all manner of fairly destructive ways to approach the faith. If you maintain relatedness, it opens up the need for conversation, to seek out, to connect, to be with, to move, to surrender to God, and to keep moving in that direction. And the more your hungering is satisfied, the hungrier you get. The more you know you don't know. The more filled with doubts you become, the more confident you are. You begin to realize that your whole life is a paradox, and living is paradoxical. A lot of people brought up in that focus on details kind of Catholicism, where you had a set of rules, set of dogmas and so forth, when the pack of cards fell down, they had no faith. They gave it all away, which is tragic, because in that Catholic tradition is immense wealth, reason to get out of bed in the morning and be a happy human being and a fulfilled human being.
In giving it all away, they often lived it more fully, didn't they? Because they lived the Christian.
Yes, I think you might be right, Mary, which actually raises a very good point, that one way to reflect on what's happening in our world, especially with younger people, if you take experience as the great teacher, I approach this generation, this time in history, as a time in which we are learning a heck of a lot from experience. Some of it will be bitter lessons, some of it will be tragic, but some of it will open our minds to things that we never knew when we were locked away in an ideological kind of religion. And it took the people breaking out and doing things different and challenging us